So I want to assure an increase of 100 rand to the old age grant. Water for the foster care, and 20 rand increase to the child support grant.
Order.
We are sensitive to the
Order.
increase in the cost of living for nearly 19 million South Africans who are really rely on these grants to make ends meet. In this regard, we have done as much as the fiscal envelope allows. Work is currently underway to improve the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant. By April the 1st, like all other grants, these grants are starting on the 1st of April. As the President has said, that is going to be improved. Work is being done. The Minister of Social Development is publishing regulations. When we finally gazette those resolutions, the new grant and the figure will be published together with those regulations. These improvements will be within the fiscal framework. For the extension of the grant beyond 2025, we have made the point that it may have to find some revenue source for it. PAC. We have also made provision for key initiatives aimed at job creation. 61.4 billion is allocated for employment program over medium term. 7.4 billion has been identified for the Presidential Employment Initiative. Government is also prioritizing fighting crime and corruption with a focus on enhancing law enforcement agency. Marx is on the 10,000 new police responsibility to promotion of law. Government is using 2.9 billion from the criminal asset recovery account to locate it. In fact, 1.7 billion allocated for the deployment of the police, including vehicle procurement in public infrastructures. Spending will support refurbishment and maintenance of existing assets and the building of new infrastructure. Madam Speaker, 2.8 trillion, or put it differently, 5.1% of total non-interest expenditure is allocated to provinces and municipalities over the next 3 years. 531.7 allocated to provinces for the next 3 years to cover the cost of implementing the 2023 made when some of the grants have been reversed. Restoring baseline of these grants will help maintain important service for the most vulnerable and provide for critical capital investment. However, to ensure public finances remain sustainable, the reduction are maintained to several other grants regarding municipalities and additional service delivery. Sadly, an unacceptable number of them are experiencing weaknesses. South Africa's G20 president is an opportunity for us to advance the most pressing economic and developmental and financial issues that face poor and developing countries. As President Ramaphosa rightly stated in his State of the Nation address, our goal is to place Africa's development at the top of the agenda when we host the G20 in 25. We are working on the necessary allocations and identification of funds to make sure that the various events are a success. As we have shown recently, South Africa remains an important regional international leader. Through participation and advocacy on platforms such as G20, we can push for substantive reform of multinational institutions like the World Bank and IMF, so that developing countries participate more equally in the decision-making process and global governance. Moral courage and know-how are not in short supply in our country. We should harness these gifts not only to better ourselves and our economy, but for the benefit of the entire continent. Madam Speaker, we've come a long way in the last 30 years. 30 years ahead of us, and whatever the challenges and opportunities they bring are something we should look forward to. Given our difficult past and some of the inevitable challenges we have faced as a young democracy trying to find its place in a world marked by a number of new and overlapping crises, it would be easy to indulge in extremes, either of blind optimism or crippling pessimism. We should resist both these extremes. Rather, we should heed the words of our first democratic President Nelson Mandela, who more than saw the pursuit of socio-economic justice and shared prosperity as a journey rather than a destination. Allow me to repeat what the President said in his closing remarks. I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I've made missteps along the way, but I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, the only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I've taken a moment to rest and to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me. To look back to the distance I have come, but I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibility. I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended. In the London. Madam Speaker, as I conclude, I want to remind South Africans that the message today should take away from this budget. Government is making the most out of its way with limited resources. We continue to support economic growth, reduce growth of government debt and the cost of debt, allocate more funds for core services, and provide the social wage. I'm grateful to the President and Deputy President for their continued support and leadership. Thank you to the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. Masono, and the excellent National Treasury team led by Director General Dr. Duncan Peterson, the majority of whom, Mr. President, are Tinswalos. Thank you to the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Services and the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. Thank you to my colleagues, the ministers in the committee of the Mincom Board and in the Budget Council, who shared the heavy load of the tough decision that meant to sustain the public finances. To Parliamentary Committee, my chairperson, Honorable Maswangani, Honorable Telezi, of course, and to my wife and family, your love, support, and forbearance are daily inspiration. Lastly, thank you to you, each and every one of South Africans, and those who have been sending messages encouraging.
The Minister of Finance. Order. The papers tabled by the Minister will be referred to the relevant committees. Honorable members, I will now suspend proceedings until 20 past.
Right, so those are live visuals coming through from the Cape Town City Hall. Of course, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana presenting his budget. To inspire ratings agencies, given what they were looking out for. But ultimately also, how is this going to affect consumers at large? We're getting reactions. Bulelani Phillips is standing.
Yeah, well, a warm welcome back again here outside the Cape Town City Hall. Now that the budget speech is all said and done, we look forward to see how the political parties react. And first up, joining me is Dr. Dion George, the spokesperson on finance. Dr. George, coming to this speech, you were not so hopeful that he will strike the right chords. But does this budget take us to the promised new dawn?
Certainly doesn't do that. It's definitely the ANC's bailout budget. As expected, the minister is now going to raid the Reserve Bank's contingency reserve that is required for risk, to manage risk. He's going to raid that to cover some of government's debt, but it's not going to be enough. Government's already paying 1 billion rand per day in interest on its debt. So taking this 150 billion from the contingency reserve, at least that, there's going to be them. The SRD grant is extended for 1 year, but what about after that? The DA proposed evolving it into a job seekers grant. Also, the increase in the child grant it's hopelessly too little. So nothing happened here. Yes, taxes did not increase directly, but they did stealthily, because what happens was, by not adjusting the tax brackets for inflation, every South African is actually going to be paying more tax because their salaries are going up according to inflation. So there is in fact a price that South Africans are paying. Also, what the minister could have done is he could have reduced the tax on fuel, for example. He could have cut the zero VAT rated basket of food. He could have done that very easily, but chose not to. And as I said this morning, the minister would have to choose whether he's going to carry on spending unsustainably on, for example, the bloated public sector wage bill and taking the debt off from Eskom and now also from Transnet, or he can focus on the needs of the people, because there wasn't any in between. And he did a dismal job today. He really did not deliver as he should have delivered to the most vulnerable South Africans battling a cost of living crisis with 5 million children in our country that are starving today, according to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund.
Talking about debt, do you think he's done enough to actually rein in the debt as you would have liked?
Well, what he's done is it appears to be taking at least 150 billion from the contingency reserve, which we don't think is a good idea, throwing it into a hole that is actually not going to get plugged. That's the key thing, because the spending is the problem. And of course growth. So we've got two problems. We've got a growth problem and a spending problem. Now growth is projected downwards to 0.6%, which means that our economy is actually get smaller, which means that there would be fewer people in jobs and then therefore less revenue. So that deficit is going to get wider. So by just throwing in this amount of money that will just disappear into this hole, nothing's going to happen. What we needed was a structural change, and that was the structural change on the big ticket items. Get the private sector involved in the state-owned enterprises. He said so, but there's no action on it. Also, cut back the public sector wage bill, because that gives enough room then for service delivery. Also, what happened is that he's basically rescinded the cuts that he had put into place because of the public sector wage bill. He's reversed that because he wants to actually feed that, unfortunately, and that is not going to work. But what he should have done is he should have focused on hard-working, battling South African households, the cost of living crisis. He never mentioned it once. He just simply doesn't care.
All right, Dr. Dion George, the spokesperson on finance of the DA, I'm going to ask you to just move out of picture, and I bring in now Steve Swart from the ACDP. Does Dinswalo live a better life after this budget?
Definitely not. And what we are seeing now, as we were concerned, we are seeing government debt levels increase. We're seeing the budget deficit increase. And having done Eskom and causing logistics crisis and power 50 billion rand balance the books. What happens next year when again we've got a problem? Is it again going to be accessed? Is it again going to be taken? So we are concerned about that aspect. Must come into it. But at the end of the day, I don't think he has addressed what is critical, and that is economic growth stimulus, so that each person can get a job, can contribute, and we can grow the economy with infrastructure development. So we as the ACDP are disappointed. We think we could have done more. But at the end of the day, we have to attribute what he's saying today to economic policies over the last 30 years that have ended and landed us as a country in where we are today, at the situation that we, for the first time ever, have to almost plunder our reserves at the South African Reserve Bank. And that is something we're going to watch very carefully. What is that money going to be used for? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. Steve Swart from the ACDP. I see off picture as well voter vessels from the Freedom Front Plus.
Change and Gold Reserve Fund. That is a government that's not planning for the future and for problems and crises that might be there in the future. But the fact of the matter is also that whilst he mentions infrastructure development, which is necessary to get the economy going, in the second adjustment appropriations bill for this current financial year that you also tabled here today, he takes away 70 million rand from the public infrastructure and he gives it to the presidency. That means that is actually, and this government is not serious about infrastructure development, because whilst saying one thing and doing the other, it's actually ridiculous. And then we have a problem with regards to actually getting the economy going. Tax bracket creeping. Individuals will pay more tax, and that will be detrimental to the economy. Also, not increasing the medical aid tax credit, the multinational for companies to create employment opportunities. So we are moving in the short term and not creating a situation where there's actual economic growth.
All right, thank you so much, Voter Vessels. I'm going to ask you to step out of picture and bringing in the UDM Chief Whip, Mr. Ngabayomzi Kwankwa. For the UDM, does this budget speech lead us to a better life for Dinswalo?
No, it doesn't. Actually, it depresses the whole nation. It pushes us further and further into the quagmire simply because of the ANC's long-standing mismanagement of the South African economy. In essence, intenzeka Bulelani sithengisa ihlangu, sithengisa iVascom, sithengisa izitya ze-country xa sithatha imali ku-central bank reserves in order for us to be able to feed the family because of that mismanagement. You are still doling out guarantees to Transnet, for example, for the 7 billion rands. You are still saying exactly the same things that they said when President Beki, for example, was still in charge. The only thing that they are trying to get right, they try to get right because it's an elections budget. They try to talk about increasing social grants. The first tranche will come now, the next one will be after election. So they are saying if you vote for us during October, you will consider one thing, that in about 2014, it's contained in their documents. Our public debt was at 1.5 trillion rands. We are at almost 6 trillion rands. And have you made a dent in the unemployment rate? Have you made a dent in the inequality rate, in the poverty rate? The answer is an emphatic no.
The EFF, as the EFF, how have you received this budget speech by the finance minister?
As expected, like that is an insult to young people of this country to not have a plan on how we're going to grow the economy of this country, to not have a plan on how our municipalities are going to budget. Less budget was given to municipalities that are at the coalface of service delivery. On a daily basis, they must make sure we live in hygiene. When you come to social spending, it's also under austerity measure. The only item that we see, which is the huge item, is the debt service. And we continue to be told, no, we will slow down on borrowing. We are not told that borrowing will stop.
Are we in dangerous territory in terms of the borrowings?
We are in the West. Our debt is costing 75% of our GDP. We are not a country that should be borrowing anything, because whatever we're making goes towards paying debt, and it's not going towards the well-being of the people. Therefore, our government has no capacity and has no business borrowing. We have to make sure that we use what we have to strengthen the issue of the economy and make sure we grow it by building the facilities that are going to work, like factories, that making sure that especially public works is taking care of all the facilities of the state, and we start outsourcing, because another item is on the issue of outsourcing where it's costing a state more than it should be. If you capacitate the state, it means that your state will spend less. But if you outsource, you are going to spend more on a budget that you do not have.
All right, thank you so much, Veronica Mende, the national chairperson. Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi, the deputy president of IFP. I know you were not so hopeful coming to this budget, but did the minister strike the right chords for you?
Nice to hear what he said, but we are very much worried about the fact that he's stepping into the reserves, which is a clear admission that they failed to ignite our economy. We can't be excited about that. As much as he has allocated some increases in different departments, but the fact of the matter is all departments are underperforming. Some are even failing to spend the allocation. We have a deficit in collection with a sales problem, yet continues to actually spend, which is very much of a problem. I think he just wanted to put a budget that will actually please people outside there, knowing very well that all those things that he have committed to and he has announced won't actually work.
Thank you so much, Inkosi Mzamo Buthelezi, the Deputy President of the IFP. Of course, a lot of food for thought from all the political parties that have just commented. For more reaction and analysis, I cross back to you, Nombu, on the other side.
The 2024 budget speech, bringing you all the government's plans for the economy and what they mean for you. How will government fiscal consolidation affect you and your money? Can the minister implement further spending reductions, or will he push to calm investors? And with South Africans going to the this year, Godongwana must also restore trust in government's ability to deliver services to all South Africans. The SABC News will bring you live coverage of the budget on the 21st of February 2024. SABC News.
2024, but that of course would have already been something that they had put out there in the market, so that people would have been aware of that. They did indicate that because they're aware that consumers have been struggling with the high cost of living, they're not going to raise the general fuel levy. So that's good news, I guess. They say that's going to save taxpayers some 4 billion rand. But what was interesting is that, you know, there's been a lot of talk about how Transnet is such an important key player for the economy, and there have been calls by the private sector for the government to put some money in there, but there was no word on any additional funds going to Transnet in this fiscal year. We know that the government did give a guarantee of 47 billion rand, and that's really for Transnet to be able to deal with some of its outstanding debt and a couple of operation issues. Now, of course, we are going to continue in conversation with an economist, but before we do that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tepa Mongwai, who has a politician with him. So they interrupted us because the thing is they want to
to the value up to 30,000 rent, and you've been asking for it, you've got it?
Well, look, the wage negotiations are still taking place in the Public Service Bargaining Council, so that hasn't been incorporated yet. So that must still be determined. We want to give space for that. But we're quite pleased with the two-part pension reform. It's in Parliament. The National Assembly passed the initial bill yesterday, so we need to get the Parliament to conclude all the bills by April so that the President can sign it. We're confident it will happen on the 1st of September, so there's been good progress in that regard. We really hope to see more support for workers and for the unemployed. So the SRD grant has been extended by another year, but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation since 2020. So it really is being eroded in terms of its value. The presidential employment program hasn't been increased. It's giving space for 400,000 young people, but we really hope, given the size of our unemployment, to have seen it increase much more substantially, especially given the President had made that commitment in the State of the Nation address.
But there are plans to invest in infrastructure. They are bringing in a course. There is some reduction in terms of debt to GDP. Government is saying that it will now come down to 74% instead of the 77.7% that was initially projected in the medium-term budget policy statement. For more reaction, I'm now handing over to Bulelani, my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Tsepo, and we'll take more reaction now. Good Party Secretary General is Brett Heron, and for you as a Good Party, is this a good story told by the Finance Minister?
No, it's not a good story at all. I mean, the story starts off with the expression by the Finance Minister that we can expect 1.1% average growth over the next few years, and that underpins what we've been saying, and that is we have an economic growth crisis in South Africa. We needed to hear from the President an economic growth plan that was coherent, and from the Minister of Finance we needed an economic growth
increases in social grants, do they go far enough?
No, they do not go far enough. And if you're going to address poverty, we need to look at the social security system. The big disappointment, obviously, was the inability of the government to move beyond the extension of this 350 rand per month social relief of distress grant. That should have been converted into a basic income grant that at least meets the lower bound poverty line of about 1,000 rand per month. So tinkering with the social grant system, adding 20 rand here, 50 rand there, 100 rand spread over 2 payments to the old age pension is simply not good enough.
All right, thank you so much, Brett Heron, Secretary General of the Good Party. I see that the bells of Parliament are ringing for another important matter, but before that begins, ATM President is Zungula. As the party, how did you receive this budget?
This budget is a missed opportunity in the sense that it did not attempt to stimulate the economy in terms of ensuring that the economy is production driven, is manufacturing driven. We've got a PIC that is managing over 2.6 trillion, but you find that majority of that 2.6 trillion goes towards companies that are listed on the JSE, and very few, a low amount goes towards the SMMEs. And again, that amount goes towards programs that are consumer driven instead of programs that are towards manufacturing and production driven. Because we're of the view as a party that in order to stimulate the economy, we need to be very, very vigorous in terms of the local production of goods and services. And the only way to do that it is to fund programs that are towards opening factories. That is the only way in which we could stimulate the economy. The second one, there's a missed opportunity on the informal sector, because that sector has got over 500 billion that is circulating that sector per annum. And majority of that sector is in the hands of foreign nationals that are coming from other countries, making use of the infrastructure of public services, but they are contributing on wanting to borrow money instead of utilizing the economies that are there in the country for tax collection.
All right, thank you so much. Vuyo Zungula is the ATM president. For more analysis, we now cross to Nobu.
With Kim Silberman. She's from Matrix Asset Management. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Kim. So, of course, economists have been looking at this budget closely. You're one of them. You went
progressive in terms of the way that it deals with redistribution of wealth, perhaps. I mean, it increased spending by around 250 billion, and that was mainly on wages and other social grants and social spending. I think the problem there is coming from, and that will determine how progressive it really is.
Of course, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana talked about this thing that we've all been hearing about recently, reliance on the golden foreign exchange contingency reserve account. Break it down for the layperson at home. What does this mean exactly? Is this a good thing? Will help government? Do they have to pay that money back?
Okay, so maybe of the rand, that's now worth a lot more. And that profit is allowed to be used by treasuries. This is not uncommon. But of course, if you access that cash as treasury, either you sell those reserves, which we don't want to do because we need reserves, or the SARB can actually just print money, which is what they're going to do. The risk that you run there is that that money could be inflationary, because essentially, and it won't be an inflation at a time when our debt service costs are rising at 17% year on year, and debt service costs are the biggest component cost. It reduces the cost of funding, and you can use it to pay down debt. So to reduce our debt stock and really put us
a quick fix, to be honest, because we see that the growth rate has actually been downwardly adjusted to 0.6% for this particular financial year, for the fiscal year 2023 to 2024, which ends at the end of March this year. But then as well, what's interesting is that the minister says that over the medium term, revenues are going to be 45 billion rand higher than expected. It's very
other things that they're going to access around, I think, 5 billion from the two-part system. And then when you increase wages that you pay government workers, you also tax those government workers. So there's money as well in increasing those wages. So in that way, we're increasing.
To us, as always, Kim Silberman. She's an economist at Matrix Asset Management. We're going to hand over now to my colleague, Tsepo Mongwai.
Thank you very much, Nompu. And of course, government and National Treasury in particular has maintained that debt consolidation continues, but also indicated that in the budget review that they will continue to make sure that some of the budget cuts that were announced in the medium-term budget policy statement are reversed. So there is some revisions in terms of those cuts. For more on this, we're now joined by FEDUSA's Secretary General, Ritva Ajam. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time. Do you think that as the workers, you have expressed unhappiness with some of the budget cuts? Is this budget speech addressing those concerns?
Well, good afternoon, first and foremostly, and let me add that this is the last budget of the sixth administration, so many of the rabbits will have to be pulled out of the hat today here. The only element that brings us a degree of comfort is only but two. Number one, that there has not been an increase in the general fuel levy, and this most certainly brings relief to millions of commuters and workers at the same time. And secondly, that the minister had heeded caution in terms of the additional allocations that had been brought forward to the budgets in terms of education, health, police in particular, and at the same time the allocation to the NHI. But we have to caution that we will be effective and stringent oversight are being brought to the fore to make sure that service delivery and the protection of our citizens are in place, especially now that we are seeing that the critical expenditure is in place. So it's to one extent assisting. On the other hand, there are some challenges that have been identified.
The inflation adjustment, or so-called bracket creep, was not announced, so it means that workers will not have that cushion against inflation. Your take on that?
Absolutely. We have uttered this before, that the minister should not treat this budget, this national budget, as a household budget. We are seeing the ravaging effects of inflation. When you get an increase, you in essence are seeing a demotion in terms of what you have as disposable income. When the electricity prices are skyrocketing, when the fuel prices are running away, and when food prices are simply not reined in, how then do we manage? So ultimately, that would have been one of the elements that we had hoped that the minister would effectively address. But unfortunately, with the lower income and the revenue that has been generated, we most certainly acknowledge that, but it must be an element that the minister has to address in future budgets.
Thank you very much. That's Ms. Ritva Ajam. He's the Secretary General of FEDUSA. I now hand over to my colleague, Bulelani Phillips.
Thank you so much, Tsepo. Of course, the opposition not impressed by the finance minister's budget speech. Let's take a look at what the ruling party says. Dr. Gwen Ramokgopa is the ANC's Treasurer General. Of course, you'd be happy as the ruling party because you would have given him counsel and guidance in terms of what he needs to put in his speech. But the question really that's been raised by the opposition is that money can be allocated, but does it go to the intended purpose?
Thank you very much, Bulelani, and greetings to viewers. Indeed, we are supportive of the minister's approach, very balanced, acknowledging that the economy is not yet fully recovered, and as he has said, he has put more money on the economic growth areas like rail, servicing of the debt, and more importantly, the investment in the social security net, schooling, health, including NHI, the initial capital to get the NHI going, and as well as looking at other services like police services and all that. So it's really balanced and responsible.
One of the key issues really raised also in the State of the Nation address is the issue of fighting crime and corruption. Now, as the ANC TG, firstly, is he a donor to the ANC? And as the ANC, how do you deal with people who have got questionable business with government and also are the donors of the party?
Bulelani, I make it very clear in the way I work that we've got three priorities. One, to improve the brand ANC. We acknowledge that there are people who did wrong things in the name of the ANC, but we are saying let the might of the law takes its toll. Let them answer. They were not sent to do wrong things. Second issue is to also have a credible and effective leadership and impactful leadership. So we stick on those principles. Obviously, from my side, also to have a balanced, a healthy balance sheet, and we are also gunning for a clean audit. So we have our books open. We are also audited by the IEC and all that, and we are accountable. If people do wrong, let them face the might of the law, like many others are.
Lastly and quickly, are you able to give us a sense of what is the ANC's election budget?
I will not now disclose that, because we are, as we implement programs, we're also fundraising. Just this morning, I had an activation breakfast for our pledge program. Donations can be as little as 10 rands. So we are funding it from our own support base and our own membership. And with that commitment that is there, the positive spirit, we're looking forward to a resounding victory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gwen Rabuchopa, the ANC Treasurer General. And for more reaction now, I cross back to my colleague, Tsepo.
And what they mean for you. How will government fiscal consolidation affect you and your money? Can the minister implement further spending reductions, or will he push for more efficiency across government? Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is under pressure to use his speech to calm investors. And with South Africans going to the polls this year, Godongwana must also restore trust in budget on the 21st of February 2024. SABC News in
Right, thank you very much. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana announced the introduction of public procurement bill, and this will actually help many small businesses who wants to access opportunities in government. But of course, there's still a lot of going to be public consultation around this bill. A lot can change in terms of the form and some of the visions that this bill espoused to achieve. For more, we're now joined by the Black Business Council CEO, Hanki Matabane. And just your reaction in terms of this speech. Are you welcoming the public procurement bill?
Thank you very much, Tsepo and the viewers. Thank you very much for having us. We welcome certain components of the speech. Firstly, we welcome the public procurement bill. It has gone through the National Assembly, and now it's left with one leg, which is the National Council of Provinces. And then from there, it goes to the president to sign. And we welcome it. If it goes in the current form, we think it will bring a lot of change and difference in small businesses, black businesses, women-owned businesses, because it's got a component that is called set-asides. So government and state-owned enterprises will be able to set aside a certain amount of procurement for small business, for people living with disabilities, for young people, for people who were marginalized in the past. So we hope the president will sign it before the end of the parliamentary process now, because if it doesn't get signed, then it means it's going to go into the next part. We also welcome the support for black farmers. It's important that we level the playing fields created by apartheid. We support the initial funding for national health insurance, but we will need more details as to the sustainability of the funding going forward. But in our view also, the budget lacks plans on industrialization, localization, so that we can create jobs here in South Africa. It also lacks plan on supporting small business, funding black business, funding youth-owned businesses. Because if you start with a problem statement to say our problem is the lack of growth we are there up there with the West as far as unemployment is concerned. So we're supposed to then say, if we want to create so many jobs, we want to create the 30 years of democracy, we're supposed to then say, how do we do that? And our view is that we can only do that by funding small business, because they've got the capability to employ more people. Those people will pay tax. The small business themselves will pay tax, and that will...
Here in the precinct of the Cape Town City Hall. Joining me now is Mansour Sheikh Imam from the NFP. You've always been talking about the issue of the social security net. Did the minister really go far enough?
You know, minister talks about appropriating a lot more funding for the police sector, safety and security cluster, but not address more and more police officers. You're going to go and buy, and like he says, some of the funds that's coming from the asset forfeiture unit is going to be buying more vehicles. This is what is going to happen all the time unless you deal with the root causes of the high levels of crime, the high levels of unemployment, the socio-economic condition under which people are living, the availability of alcohol and drugs in the township, taverns being open 24 hours, more and more social grants rather than making people productive, giving them their dignity back, you know, so that they can earn a living and get back their dignity. But it's not happening. You know, the minister talks about infrastructure, 948 or so billion rand he wants to set aside. But he knows very well we don't have the capacity to be able to implement this. And more importantly, he knows and understands, and the former CEO of supply chain raised this before he left. 40% on goods and services is lost in this country because you don't get value for money. Now, can you imagine you setting aside 900 and somewhat billion rand and 40% of that is going because you're not getting value for money? Now, the new the procurement bill will go a long way in dealing with it. But have we put sufficient measures in place to stop it? Certainly not. Minister is admitting that we're not even, you know, paying market-related prices for the goods you're buying for the state, and it should have been cheaper because we're buying in bulk. It's not the case because people, this is a milking cow, and they're milking measures in trying to close those gaps. And I can tell you what is frightening for me is now we're even going to touch on those gold reserves that, you know, 150 billion rand he might be taking away from them. He doesn't talk about, you know, stopping the borrowing of money. He wants to reduce it. But
economists are actually trying to look into with regards to this budget speech. I'm now joined by Nedbank's economist Isaac Matiego, just to take us through some of
presents are the faster than initially expected increase in tax revenue will help to reduce the budget fall to below 4% by 2026-2027.
What surprised me is the cost containment measures. They say that they are going to reverse some of those cost-cutting measures that were announced in the...
So education, but other personnel costs will be controlled very strictly. And I believe it's the right thing to do, saying that, you know, where we're coming from. Before COVID, there were very high increases, and it's about time to contain that expenditure burden.
Is this approach sustainable, given that they had to use the foreign contingency reserves in order to reduce our debt to GDP?
Well, we're going to have to implement the hard measures to ensure that the increase of the debt stock is kept under control. Over the next 3 years, we're tapping about 150 billion